A dusty Mississippi juke joint, late 1920s. The air is thick with smoke and sweat as a lanky teenager named Robert Johnson fumbles with a guitar on stage. He strikes a chord. It comes out clanging and sour. Laughter erupts. "Get off that guitar, boy!" someone hollers, while others jeer and cover their ears. Even the famed bluesman Sunhouse, sitting off to the side, shakes his head in embarrassment. Between his own sets, House sometimes let the eager kid play a song, only to have Johnson drive the people nuts with his awful racket. Tonight is no different. Robert's cheeks burn as the crowd's ridicule swells. To them, he's a nobody, just a talentless kid with delusions of grandeur. They mockingly call for another song, laughing as he stumbles through a tune. Each bundled note draws new hoots and cruel taunts. Johnson's hands tremble on the frets. He feels every snicker like a thorn. Finally, Sunhouse himself stands up and snatches the guitar away. Unable to bear the din mortified, Robert Johnson slinks out into the darkness to a chorus of laughter. What none of those people realized was that the laughter would soon stop. Something was about to change, and no one could explain how. Robert Leroy Johnson was never destined for greatness, or so it seemed. He was born in 1911 to a poor black family in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, a speck on the Delta map. His mother, Julia, had already endured hardships no one should face. She'd been left nearly destitute after fleeing an angry lynch mob in Hazelhurst, and young Robert grew up amid grinding poverty and backbreaking labor. As a boy, he was expected to pick cotton under the searing sun, an existence not far removed from slavery in all but name. By all accounts, Robert hated the fields. He'd sneak away from the plow whenever he could, drawn instead to the sound of music drifting from the juke joints on Saturday nights. Traveling bluesmen would roll through the plantations, guitars in hand, offering a glimpse of another life. A life without a cruel boss or a cotton sack on your back. To a teenager with nothing but dirt to his name, it was intoxicating. The blues spoke to Robert's soul. But playing the blues wasn't just a dream. In the 1920s Delta, it was a dangerous calling. Preachers thundered from pulpits that blues music was the devil's work, and many in the community believed them. Nights in the juke joints meant drinking, dancing, and gambling, sinful pursuits in God-fearing eyes. A bluesman's life could be free, yes, but it was a life lived in constant motion, facing poverty and peril at every turn. For a young black man in Mississippi, roaming from town to town was risky enough. Add the whiff of devil's music, and trouble could be around any corner. Robert knew the risks. He knew what people said, but the music called to him stronger than any fear. Still, he tried to live a normal life at first. In 1929, at just 18, Robert married a girl named Virginia. Maybe he thought he could settle down to farming and family, as everyone expected. Maybe he hoped to escape the hard life of a rambling bluesman. Those hopes ended in heartbreak. His young wife, only 16 and pregnant, died in childbirth in 1930, along with their baby. Robert was shattered. To make it worse, Virginia's family laid the blame at Robert's feet. In their grief, they saw her death as divine punishment for Robert's music. He had been singing secular blues instead of gospel, and to them he had essentially sold his soul to the devil by playing the devil's music. The accusations cut deep. Robert was a church-going boy once, and now the people he loved were saying his passion for blues had invited a curse. According to one account, Robert himself accepted this dark verdict. He took it as a sign that he'd already paid a price, so he might as well dedicate himself entirely to the blues. With nothing left to lose, Robert Johnson left the settled life of a husband and farmer behind. He picked up his guitar and hit the road, embracing the very path that had branded him an outcast. He was poor, alone, and by many accounts not even a good musician. Not yet. But he had resolve. If the devil had taken his wife for the blues, Robert would make the blues worth it. He headed north to the Delta hubs, places like Robinsonville and Tunica, where the blues was alive in every ramshackle juke joint and street corner. By 1930, Robert was hanging around the performances of local blues kings Son House and Willie Brown. House was a former preacher-turned-bluesman known for his ferocious slide guitar. Willie Brown was his skilled sideman. Together, they drew crowds of sharecroppers on Saturday nights, and young Robert was their shadow, watching, learning, and pestering. He'd carry House's guitar, sit at their feet, absorb everything. He also played a mean harmonica that at least everyone agreed on, and House would let the kid join on harp for a song or two. But Robert's true obsession was the guitar. He longed to prove himself on those 6 strings like his heroes. There was a big problem, though. Robert was awful on guitar. Son House would later recall that the teenager was a decent harmonica player, but an embarrassingly bad guitarist. Whenever Robert tried to pick up a guitar at a gathering, it was painful to hear. He had no finesse, no timing, just raw enthusiasm and raw technique. At first, people were patient. They indulged the skinny kid's ambitions. That patience didn't last. Every time Robert attempted to play publicly ended in disaster. The failure wasn't a one-time event. It became a ritual of humiliation. He might wait until Son House took a break during a dance, then nervously take the stage with a borrowed guitar. Perhaps he truly believed he'd improve enough in his bedroom practice sessions. But the moment he struck the first chords, the mood in the juke joint soured. His notes clanged and clashed. His rhythms fell apart. The crowd would start murmuring, then groaning, then shouting over him. "Oh Lord, make it stop." One woman would yell dramatically to a roar of laughter. Men at the bar shook their heads, chuckling at the poor kid's audacity. Robert would soldier on, sweat on his brow, praying the next note might redeem the last. It never did. On one occasion, he tried playing one of Son House's signature blues numbers right in front of the master. House winced as Robert mangled the tune. Finally, House stood up, exasperated, and told him in plain words to put the guitar down and get out of there. As House later recounted, Johnson's guitar playing was so bad that people literally shouted him down whenever he tried to perform. Night after night, juke joint after juke joint, the story was the same. Robert would beg for a chance to play, and the audience would practically chase him off. Imagine the toll that took on him. He'd show up to these dives with his guitar like a stray dog hoping for a scrap, and he'd be sent packing in shame every time. Some nights, he'd slip away quietly amid the laughter, only to cry angry tears in the dark Mississippi fields. Other times, he'd get defensive, insisting to anyone who would listen that he'd be great one day, which only made the locals laugh harder. In those dingy taverns with whiskey flowing and the scent of fried fish in the air, Robert Johnson became the butt of cruel jokes. Talentless. Pathetic. That's what they called him to his face. Son House, annoyed by the disturbance to his own show, would tease Robert too, perhaps thinking a little tough love might scare him straight. "Boy, better stick to the harp," House would say, rolling his eyes as Robert slunk away. Willie Brown and the others chuckled. It was almost a comedy routine, the kid who thought he could play the blues. But for Robert, it was deadly serious. Each rejection was a wound to his soul. How could the music that felt like salvation to him bring him nothing but ridicule? He had lost his family for this music, and now the music itself was betraying him in public. The humiliation came to a breaking point on a night not unlike the one in our opening scene. After yet another disastrous attempt that ended with roaring laughter and someone yanking the guitar from his hands, Robert could take no more. He set the guitar down gently, eyes fixed on the floor to hide the tears welling up, and walked out into the midnight air. This time, he didn't just want her home to brood. This time, Robert Johnson vanished. By sunrise, he was nowhere to be found in Robinsonville. His friends and fellow musicians looked around. The kid who had been a constant, if annoying, presence at every jam was suddenly gone without a trace. He disappeared from the face of the earth. One person would say later. Indeed, It was as if Robert Johnson just evaporated into the Delta mist. Weeks passed, then months with no sign of him. In juke joints up and down the Delta, nobody saw Robert. Some assumed he'd given up music and gone back to farm work and shame. Others whispered that maybe he'd met a bad end. A drifter like him could easily find trouble on those lonely roads. But really, no one knew what happened. His disappearance was total. In a community bound by gossip, it was as if Robert Johnson never existed. Behind the scenes, a few clues emerged. People recalled that Robert had mentioned finding his real father, who lived near Hazelhurst, where Robert was born. Maybe, they reckoned, he'd headed south to seek family and regroup. There was also a rumor that he'd been seen with an older man named Ike Zimmerman, a blues guitarist from the Hazelhurst area and known for his skill. But Ike was an odd character himself. Folks said Ike Zimmerman learned guitar by sitting atop tombstones at midnight, picking in the graveyard where no one could disturb him. It sounded like tall-tale nonsense, except, as some would later note, that's exactly the kind of teacher Robert Johnson would have needed. Wherever he went, Robert did not return to Robinsonville for a long time. A year passed, then almost two. The juke joint regulars moved on, and Robert became a fading memory, the punchline to an old joke nobody told anymore. The blues nights continued without him, Sunhouse and Willie Brown playing to packed halls, while Robert Johnson's name fell into obscurity. The boy they had laughed off stage was forgotten. And then he came back. One evening in 1931, or perhaps 1932, memories conflict on the date. Sunhouse and Willie Brown were once again the main attraction at a packed Delta juke joint. Some say it was in Banks, Mississippi. Others recall a spot outside Robinsonville. The whiskey was flowing, couples were dancing, and the tinny glow of kerosene lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls. During intermission, as the musicians tuned up for the next set, a figure emerged from the corner of the room carrying a guitar. At first, few noticed him. He was quiet and unassuming, a young man in a threadbare suit and a felt hat, slightly older than the last time most had seen him. But then Sunhouse looked up from adjusting his slide and did a double take. Could it be? Robert Johnson, that scrawny kid who had disappeared, was standing there in front of him. House and Brown exchanged glances of surprise. The crowd started to murmur as recognition spread. Some smirked. Oh, here we go again, they thought, the return of the prodigal clown. Whispers flew. That's that Johnson boy who couldn't play a lick, ain't it? A couple of men chuckled in anticipation of another Sobadit's funny performance. Robert, for his part, said few words. He may have greeted his old idols politely, or perhaps just nodded. He asked if he could play a song. Willie Brown was about to dismiss him, but Sunhouse, curious and maybe a bit paternal, decided to let the kid have one more chance. After all, it had been a long time. Maybe Robert learned a little something on his travels. House stepped back, and Robert Johnson stepped forward onto the tiny stage, guitar in hand. When Robert sat down and began to play, everything changed in an instant. His fingers danced across the strings with confident ease, and a chord poured forth that silenced the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned, eyes wide, toward the source of this sound. Surely, that couldn't be coming from the same awkward boy who left town. Robert launched into a blues song. Some say it was one of Sunhouse's own numbers. Others recall it as an original Robert had composed. Whatever it was mesmerizing. His guitar style was fluid and complex, the notes bending and ringing in haunting harmony. He wasn't just playing the guitar, he was commanding it, teasing out rhythms and licks that no one in that juke joint had ever heard before. His voice, once thin and unsure, now came out strong and emotive, wailing the blues with bone-chilling intensity. People's jaws literally dropped. Willie Brown nearly spilled his drink. Sunhouse's eyes grew big as saucers. One witness said you could hear the sound of the entire audience's collective breath being taken away at once. It was that unbelievable. That should not have been possible. House reportedly muttered under his breath. completely astounded. In the space of one song, one flawless, spine-tingling song, Robert Johnson transformed from laughingstock to legend in the making. By the time he hit the final chord, a heavy, awed silence blanketed the room. Then came the eruptions, thunderous applause, whoops of astonishment, people shouting, "Lord have mercy! Play that again." No one was laughing now. They were begging for more. Son House walked up to Robert in a daze. "Robert, honey," he said, "where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Robert just gave a little smile. His eyes were intense, but there was something distant in them too, as if he'd seen things out there on the road that he couldn't quite talk about. Willie Brown shook his head, grinning in disbelief, and slapped his knee. The same men who had mocked Robert mercilessly a year before now crowded around to shake his hand or slap his back. That night, word began to spread like wildfire across the Delta. Robert Johnson came back a different man. In seemingly no time at all, he had gone from inept novice to the greatest blues guitar player anyone had ever heard. For the superstitious folk of Mississippi, there was simply no natural explanation for such a metamorphosis. It wasn't just improvement. It was a miracle, or perhaps an unholy miracle. "He's not just good," people whispered wide-eyed. "He's scary good." Indeed, to those who heard him upon his return, Robert's playing was otherworldly. What they didn't realize during that first astonishing performance was that they were witnessing the birth of a legend, a forbidden story that would be whispered for decades. In the following days and weeks, rumors flew across counties. How could a boy who couldn't strum a tune to save his life vanish for maybe a year and resurface as a virtuoso? Folks recalled the old whispers about selling your soul for musical talent, a concept not unfamiliar in Southern folklore. The whispers crystallized into a dark legend. Robert Johnson must have made a pact with the devil. There was no other way to explain it, they figured. Son House himself, when pressed for an explanation, reportedly chuckled and said, "The only thing I know, that boy must have sold his soul to play like that." It was an offhand remark born of amazement, but people took it and ran with it. Soon the story grew legs. They said one midnight, Robert Johnson took his guitar to a lonely crossroads somewhere in the Mississippi Delta. Perhaps it was near Dockery Plantation, where the dark pines met under the moon. Or maybe at the junction of Highway 61 and 49 in Clarksdale, where a large crossroads sign now stands. Some pointed to a crossroads in Rosedale down by the river. The exact location didn't matter as much as the tale itself. The tale goes that at this witching hour crossroad, Robert met a shadowy figure, the devil in the form of a large black man. The figure greeted him by name, as the story has it, and asked to see Robert's guitar. Trembling, Robert handed it over. The stranger, who else could it be but Old Scratch, took the guitar, tuned it with a few deft twists, and then played a few licks. Music so haunting and beautiful that Robert knew he was face to face with something not of this world. The devil then handed the guitar back to Robert Johnson. "That's all there is to it," he supposedly said with a wicked grin. In that moment, so the legend claims, Robert Johnson's soul was the devil's, and the mastery of the guitar was Robert's. He could suddenly play anything, everything, with otherworldly skill. In exchange, the devil would come to collect his due at a later time. This Crossroads Pack story was not entirely new. Older folks remembered that another Delta bluesman, Tommy Johnson, no relation, used to boast that he had sold his soul at a crossroads for guitar prowess. But now the tale attached itself firmly to Robert. It helped that Robert's name was Johnson too, causing some confusion and merging of myths. It also helped that Robert himself wasn't going around denying it. He mostly smirked or stayed coy when people asked how he got so good so fast. If anything, he leaned into the mystery, and the people around him, especially those who had witnessed the before and after, they truly believed something supernatural had occurred. 2 years of woodshed practice could improve a man, sure, but this felt impossible. He learned in the graveyard at midnight, some would say in hushed voices, referring to the rumors of Robert's time with Ike Zimmerman. Indeed, word spread that Robert had spent his absence under Ike's tutelage, practicing guitar, sitting atop tombstones in the dead of night, literally learning from the spirits of the departed. That image was chilling and fit perfectly alongside the Crossroads myth. Maybe Robert hadn't met Satan himself, skeptics allowed, but he had been communing with ghosts in graveyards to get his skills. Either way, it wasn't a god. That was for sure, they whispered. Robert Johnson, for his part, began to carry an aura of mystery and danger after his return. People who heard him play would look around nervously, as if expecting to see the devil standing in the back of the room, tapping his foot. His music only amplified the legend. In 1936 and 1937, Robert wrote and recorded songs that, in hindsight, seemed to confirm every dark rumor. In one of his most famous numbers, Crossroad Blues, he sang of going down to the crossroads and falling to his knees, begging the Lord for mercy and salvation. To listeners who knew the legend, it sounded like a thinly veiled reference to that fateful midnight meeting. A man at the crossroads desperately praying because he knows he's done a deal with the devil. Another song, Hellhound on My Trail, was downright eerie, Robert's voice trembling over a low moan of the guitar as he sings about something chasing him, hellhound on my trail, as if he's being pursued by demonic forces he can't escape. In Me and the Devil Blues, he chillingly starts, early this morning, when you knocked upon my door, me and the devil was walking side by side. The lyrics painted a picture of a man in intimate company with Satan himself. Even a track titled Up Jumped the Devil left little to the imagination. All told, a handful of Robert's songs explicitly referenced devils, hellhounds, and the crossroads, enough to make even skeptical listeners wonder. It was as if Robert Johnson was dropping clues in the grooves of his records, winking at those who knew the legend. Each song fueled the fire. Surely, only a man who had bargained away his soul would dare sing such lines. In truth, blues musicians often use devil imagery as metaphors for trouble and hardship, but in Robert's case the coincidences were too juicy for folks to ignore. The legend of the devil at the crossroads became inseparable from Robert Johnson's name. Night after night, as he traveled and performed, the whispers followed him. That man met the devil. That man ain't natural. Some audience members would watch him with a mix of awe and fear, swaying to his hypnotic guitar runs, yet clutching talismans or Bible verses under their breath, just in case. If Robert noticed, he didn't let on. He'd tip his hat, flash a disarming smile, and play the songs people requested, from bawdy blues to sweet ballads, whatever kept the tips flowing. He had gotten what he wanted: musical greatness, respect, even if laced with fear, and the life of an itinerant bluesman, roaming free. But that success came with a shadow. The transformation had a cost. The Robert Johnson who came back from oblivion was not the wide-eyed, eager kid who had left. Friends observed a subtle change in him. He was more confident, yes, but also more reserved, even brooding when alone. On stage, he could charm anyone, but off stage, he sometimes seemed preoccupied, looking over his shoulder as if something unseen trailed him. Some of his acquaintances later said he became jumpy at sudden noises, or quiet and distant for stretches. It was as if he carried a burden that no one else could see. His life certainly took on the restless, haunted quality of the blues songs he sang. He drifted constantly from town to town, Greenwood, Clarksdale, Helena, Memphis, back down to smaller Delta Crossroads towns, and even beyond Mississippi's borders. He rarely stayed anywhere more than a few weeks. One of his traveling partners, fellow musician Johnny Shines, described how Robert would be playing a packed house, enthralling everyone, and then suddenly, Robert'd just pick up and walk off, and you wouldn't see Robert no more maybe in 2 or 3 weeks. He was like a man who could never quite rest, never settle. He also embraced the vices of the blues life with a new ferocity. The quiet, polite youth was replaced by a roaming, rambling bluesman who loved whiskey and women with equal abandon. In every juke joint, he'd have a bottle by his side and an eye for the prettiest girl in the room. He cultivated a network of lady friends in various towns, women who would take him in, cook for him, keep him company, until he inevitably moved on. Preachers would have said he was living in sin, and perhaps Robert thought so too, deep down. But he pressed on as if compelled. Some who knew him believed he was trying to outrun something, be it guilt, trauma, or perhaps the very hellhounds he sang about. I gotta keep moving, he cries in Hellhound on My Trail, almost as a mantra. It's not hard to imagine Robert on a lonely country road at dusk, guitar slung over his shoulder, glancing back at the empty path and feeling eyes in the darkness, whether human or demonic. He sang it in his songs. He felt hunted. Indeed, those close to him recounted that at times Robert seemed truly frightened, or at least eerily resigned to a fate closing in. In one chilling account, a fellow bluesman swore he heard Robert mutter, "The devil's done called my name," after a particularly raucous night. Perhaps it was spoken in jest or drunkenness, but given the legends swirling around him, such remarks only added to his mystique. Robert's own lyrics foretold doom often. Another of his songs, Stones in My Passway, speaks of stumbling and not being able to carry on. In Me and the Devil Blues, he even alludes to the devil coming to collect him one morning. Was it poetic imagery, or was Robert truly foreseeing an early death as the price of his bargain? Nobody can say for sure. But those who believe in the supernatural like to point out that Robert Johnson's meteoric rise came with an ominous ticking clock. He had gotten everything he wanted, and now perhaps he was living on borrowed time. The end, when it came, was as murky and unsettling as the rest of Robert's tale. It was the summer of 1938. Robert Johnson was 27 years old and back in the Delta after roaming to places as far as St. Louis and Chicago on his adventures. He found himself playing a series of gigs around Greenwood, Mississippi. One hot August night, Robert was performing at a country juke joint called Three Forks, not far from the tiny crossroads town of Itabena. The place was packed and rowdy. As always, Robert played to the crowd, singing, flirting, drinking. He especially paid attention to a pretty young woman who was there most nights. She was the wife of the juke joint's owner, or according to some, the wife of a local tenant farmer. Stories differ, but all agree she was married and not to Robert. Robert either didn't know or didn't care. He charmed her openly. It was a dangerous game, and someone was watching. During an intermission, the woman's husband or the bar manager, again, details diverge, decided to put a deadly plan in motion. He handed Robert an open bottle of whiskey as a gift. A small gesture of hospitality, it seemed. Robert, who never refused free liquor, reached for it. Just then, fellow bluesman David Honeyboy Edwards, who was present, intervened. Honeyboy had noticed the seal on the bottle was broken, a red flag. He slapped the bottle out of Robert's hand before it reached his lips, warning, "Don't ever drink from a bottle you ain't seen open, man." Robert snapped back, annoyed at the loss of good whiskey, and chastised Edwards, "Don't you ever knock a bottle out of my hand again." The room tensed, but when another whiskey bottle was offered moments later by the same source, Robert, pride wounded and eager for a drink, took it and drank deeply. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. Not long after, Robert Johnson began to feel sick. At first it might have been a slight dizziness, a stomach cramp. He tried to keep playing, but the pain grew quickly, viciously. By the end of the night, Robert had to be helped off the stage. He was violently ill, vomiting, delirious, doubled over in agony. Friends carried him to a nearby makeshift bed. Over the next 2 days, his condition deteriorated dramatically. Whatever was in that bottle was killing him slowly. Some say it was strychnine poison, mixed into the whiskey, a common murderous trick in those parts. Others suggest it might have been a toxin like naphthalene from mothballs dissolved in the liquor. The poison, whatever it was, worked its evil over time. Robert's entire body was racked with pain. He had never been a large man, and now he withered, feverish and moaning. Witnesses later reported that he died in a convulsive state, suffering for hours on end with severe abdominal pain and bleeding. This was no peaceful passing. In the throes of his torment, Robert lost his senses. In fact, one lurid account claims that in his final hours, he fell to his hands and knees and began howling and barking like a dog, as if the hellhounds he sang about had finally caught up to him. People who were there have never forgotten the sound. A man reputed to have the devil's own skill, now crawling on all fours and howling at the moon. It was a terrifying, keening wail that did not sound human, more like an animal in the night. To the superstitious, it was confirmation. The devil had come to collect Robert's soul, and Robert was crying out in protest as hell's hounds dragged him down. On August 16th, 1938, after nearly 3 days of agony, Robert Johnson died in a ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of Greenwood. He was 27 years old. The official cause of death? Unknown. No doctor examined the body in time. No autopsy was performed. In fact, Robert's death was so low-key that it wasn't even reported in the newspapers. It simply slipped into local lore, another black man dead under murky circumstances in the segregated South. Robert was hastily buried the following day. A pine coffin, a simple burial, likely in a grave dug by local sharecroppers. But where exactly his body was laid to rest remains a mystery to this day. In the decades since, researchers have identified at least 3 different grave sites in the Greenwood area that claim to be Robert Johnson's final resting place. One is at a little church called Mount Zion Missionary Baptist, marked now by a 1-ton tombstone listing his song titles. Another lies in a small graveyard in Quito, Mississippi, where a humble marker reads, "Resting in the Blues." A third is under a big pecan tree at Little Zion Church, where an aging witness swore Robert was buried and where a record label placed a marker years later. Which, if any, contains Robert's bones? No one knows. It's as if in death, just like in life, Robert Johnson is everywhere and nowhere, his body scattered in legend. Some say the ambiguity is fitting. If you sell your soul to the devil, maybe you don't get a marked grave. Maybe you're doomed to wander. Not long after Robert died, the man who had wanted him dead bragged quietly that he'd fixed the bluesman for messing with his wife. But no charges were ever brought. To the white authorities, it was just another black man dead. To the black community, it was justice of a sort. Robert reaped what he sowed by crossing that line with another man's woman. But among Robert's friends and fellow musicians, a different explanation took root and never let go. The devil came and got him. Honeyboy Edwards, who saw Robert in his final moments, reportedly said it was the worst thing he'd ever seen, as if Robert was torn apart from the inside. How else to explain such a grotesque end for a man who played like an angel? For those who believed the Crossroads story, Robert's death was the grim fulfillment of the contract. He had his few shining years of unmatched talent, and then the bill came due. The hellhounds he sang of weren't metaphorical at all. They were literal, and they had finally dragged Robert down to hell. So there was Robert Johnson, buried in uncertain ground, taken before anyone outside the Delta really knew his name. In a cruel twist of fate, just 2 months after his death, a promoter from New York actually came searching for Robert to invite him to perform at Carnegie Hall. Legendary producer John Hammond had heard Robert's records and was blown away. He was organizing a concert called From Spirituals to Swing to showcase great American music, and he wanted the unknown bluesman from Mississippi to be a star attraction. But Hammond arrived too late. Robert was gone. Big Bill Brunzi had to fill in for him at Carnegie Hall, and Hammond played one of Robert's records to the crowd in tribute. The audience in New York heard that scratchy recording of Walk-In Blues echo through the Grand Hall, and marveled at the unknown guitarist's skill. They applauded, and Hammond lamented the tragedy that Robert Johnson would never stand on that stage in person. The world was just a few steps behind Robert, and he was already a ghost. For a long time after, Robert Johnson was mainly spoken of in blues circles and whispers. His records, only a handful, were scattered and not widely distributed. But those who had heard them carried the flame. Over the years, the legend only grew. In the juke joints of the South, Robert's songs became standards, covered by other bluesmen, studied by aspiring guitarists who marveled at his technique and maybe wondered if they should try taking their own guitar down to some midnight crossroads. By the 1950s and 60s, as a folk and blues revival blossomed, the name Robert Johnson found new ears. Young musicians in America and England dug up old 78 revolutions per minute records and found Johnson's among them. When Columbia Records finally released an LP of his recordings in 1961, titled King of the Delta Blues Singers, it electrified a new generation. Here was this obscure Mississippi bluesman who had died before World War II, yet his music felt raw and alive. The legend of the Crossroads came packaged with it, printed in liner notes and recounted in magazine articles. It captured imaginations far and wide. Aspiring rockers like Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, they listened in awe. Clapton later called Robert Johnson the most important blues singer that ever lived, and he meant it. The Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin would both borrow riffs and lyrics from Johnson's songs. Bob Dylan cited Johnson's fierce, otherworldly performances as a key influence on his own songwriting. In a way, Robert Johnson became a phantom mentor to some of the biggest rock stars of the 20th century, none of whom were even born when Robert allegedly made his devil's bargain. The ripple effect of Robert's brief life is staggering. He recorded only 29 songs during 2 recording sessions. 29 songs, but within those grooves lay the DNA of much of modern music. Sweet Home Chicago, I Believe I'll Dust My Broom, Love in Vain. These Johnson tunes would be covered and reimagined countless times, spreading the blues far beyond the Delta. His guitar licks, those nimble fingers that once stunned a juke joint into silence, became a treasure trove pilfered lovingly by blues and rock guitarists for decades. Every time you hear a searing guitar solo or a bluesy riff in rock music, you're hearing echoes of Robert Johnson. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame later described him as perhaps the first ever rock star, not in fame, but in mythos and influence. Long before the 27 Club was a notion, that eerie roster of stars like Hendrix, Joplin, and others who also died at 27, Robert Johnson was its charter member, the original young musical comet who burned too bright, too fast, and winked out mysteriously. To this day, musicians make pilgrimages to the Delta to stand at the intersection of Highway 61 and 49 in Clarksdale, the purported crossroads, and feel the tingle of Robert's story. There's a highway sign there now with 2 big cross guitars, a monument to the legend. Tourists snap pictures under the blazing sun, imagining a lone figure waiting there one midnight long ago. What really happened to Robert Johnson during that lost year? Did he simply practice night and day under a master's guidance, honing his craft with extraordinary dedication? Almost certainly yes. The mundane truth is that hard work and talent transformed him. But that's not the story people tell. Instead, they tell of hellhounds and devils, of midnight bargains struck under oak trees at deserted crossroads. They tell of a man who gave up salvation for a guitar's strings. And in the end, maybe Robert himself preferred it that way. After all, a mortal man could be forgotten, but a myth lives on forever. In the final analysis, the laughter that once greeted Robert Johnson was silenced not just by his music, but by the enduring enigma of his life. Those who had laughed the loudest ended up telling his tale in hushed, reverent tones. The sharecropper's son who was never supposed to matter became a legend whose influence spanned continents. Robert's entire life lasted only 27 years, yet the shadow he cast is immeasurable. The humble dirt roads he walked have become iconic pathways in music history, and the questions he left behind are as tantalizing as ever. On a quiet night, if you find yourself driving down Highway 61 through the Delta, you might feel an urge to pull over a lonely crossroads and shut off your engine. The stars overhead are bright, the humid air utterly still. In that heavy silence, you may imagine for a moment a figure approaching out of the dark, a man in a suit and floppy hat, guitar slung on his back. Perhaps you hear a few notes of a blues melody faint on the breeze. Could it be the ghost of Robert Johnson, still searching for peace he never found in life? Or was it just the wind playing tricks? You'll likely never know. Robert Johnson left this world with an abundance of unanswered questions. No tidy conclusion, no definitive answers, just a haunting, lingering sense of wonder. They laughed at his guitar playing once, but no one laughs anymore. Now we only marvel and shiver slightly when we hear his recordings, full of their eerie passion. We remember the price he may have paid. We ponder the legend that has him forever at a crossroads at midnight, guitar in hand, facing down the devil for the sake of a song. It is a story that remains as unresolved and captivating as a balloon note that hangs in the air, daring us to follow. Robert Johnson's life is gone, his grave uncertain, but his music and myth refuse to die. And as long as people talk about the blues, they will talk about that fateful night at the crossroads. They will feel a chill, and they will listen to Robert Johnson's songs, straining to hear, in those scratchy old recordings, the very moment where a man might have traded his soul for a dream. In the end, perhaps that's the real legacy of Robert Johnson. A few precious records, a style that transformed music, and a story that reminds us of the thin line between genius and darkness. His final notes fade out, but the silence that follows is full of whispers. Was it true? Did he really meet the devil? We'll never definitively know. Robert took the truth with him, disappearing one last time into the ether. What remains is the legend, and it's that legend which carries his name onward, ensuring that Robert Johnson's shadow looms large over music history, forever standing at the crossroads of fact and myth, midnight and dawn, laughter and awe. Somewhere in the distance, a lone blues guitar cries, and the sound, like Robert's story, is timeless and haunting.